We are in our final couple weeks of the Gospel of Matthew, and I was just kind of thinking about it's been over a year, maybe almost a year and a half now. So maybe you're coming to this point and you're thinking, thank God it's finally over, or maybe you're just amazed, like I am, that we just have the privilege to walk through a book like this in such depth with such longevity. I think, to be honest, it's something that I've found is more and more rare these days, church, especially in a city like ours, to be able to walk through the Bible in its entirety, walk through a book of the Bible in its entirety. So for this morning, we're going to be looking at Matthew 27. We're going to start in verse 32. We're going to make our way through it throughout the sermon, but I'm just going to start and read in the first section there, 32 through 44, and then we'll read the subsequent sections as we go along. Start in Matthew 27, starting in verse 32. You have to excuse me. While salvation has come today, sickness has come to my house. So I'm going to be struggling a little bit to get through this, but we'll get through it. As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head, they put the charge against him, which reads, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Then two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now, if he desires him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. I don't know if you're aware, but this year marks the 20th anniversary of the film, The Passion of the Christ. It came out in February of 2004. I remember it clearly because I was in high school when the film came out. And naturally, it being this big blockbuster Hollywood film, I think directed by Mel Gibson, a Christian film nonetheless, a lot of my friends at their youth groups sought to go and watch the film. The problem was this was an R-rated film, and I was at a conservative Chinese church, and so there was no way the youth pastor was going to bring his youth group to watch an R-rated film. Well, myself and some of the other upperclassmen in the youth ministry decided we're going to go watch it anyways. And so we gathered a group and we went on a Saturday morning to go watch The Passion of the Christ. Thought we were doing a great Christian thing, leading our youth group to do that. But there was one problem because it was R-rated and we were all under 18. We could not buy our own tickets to watch the film. We had to ask some random adults standing in line to buy tickets for about 30 teenagers to watch this film. And we were pleading with them, please, we love Jesus. We want to watch this film. And I just remember that experience of watching that film. We did get in, we were able to get tickets. But I remember just honestly, the shock at the film. If you're familiar and you've seen it, maybe you remember feeling similarly shocked at the quite graphic depictions of Jesus' beating and crucifixion and death. And while it's very historically accurate, they did, I think, an incredible job of digging into the backgrounds. What I find interesting is that when it comes to our accounts of the crucifixion in Scripture, they lack much of the shock and awe and gore of a film like The Passion of the Christ. The gospel writers don't really seem that interested in the physical details surrounding Jesus' death. I mean, they are interested in the details, but not in the way that we tend to think. Even the one line that we're told when Jesus is crucified, it's kind of a toss-out line. We're told in verse 35, when they had crucified him, they divided his garments. That term crucified, that word for crucified, it's not even the main verb of that sentence. It's a supporting verb to the other word, they're dividing his garments. And it seems like for Matthew and the gospel writers, they're maybe intentionally shying away from the physical dimensions of Jesus' suffering on the cross. Some commentators think that maybe it's because it was too gruesome to describe. Why would they want to revisit such a gruesome depiction of their Savior's death? Maybe it's because it was well known what crucifixion meant to their time, to their peers and their readers, so they didn't need to go over the gory details. But it seems kind of a significant detail to just pass over. Any reader of fiction will know that when an author wants to draw you into a story, they'll describe the events with vividness and detail. And yet Matthew gives us none of that, at least when it concerns Jesus' physical sufferings. I think there is vividness and detail, but it's focused elsewhere. And so in this sermon, we're not going to look maybe traditionally at what the cross means and what Jesus did and what happened to him, but rather I think what Matthew's presenting for us is, what does the cross accomplish and how does he desire people to respond to Jesus, the crucified Messiah? So we're going to look at three characters that reveal what Jesus accomplished and how Matthew intends us to respond, starting with Simon. Seemingly insignificant character, but Matthew leads us to embrace scorn with Simon. He's the very first character that we're told about in this story, and he takes up the cross of Jesus. What's interesting is throughout this depiction of the crucifixion, Matthew, he doesn't focus on the physical, as we mentioned, but he focused more on the social dimensions of Jesus' crucifixion, the shame surrounding crucifixion. It's likely that Matthew is trying to pull us in to see that the social shame that Jesus felt was maybe just as much or even more so a greater suffering for Jesus than the physical things he went through. I mentioned that the word crucified, the place where Jesus is crucified, it's a supporting verb to dividing his garments. I think maybe Matthew's intentional about that because he wants us to remember the way that people were crucified. When they divided his garments, that meant Jesus was crucified naked with nothing on his body. He would have nothing to cover himself. And even beyond that, he was crucified naked in a public place. If you look again at verse 39, and those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. Now, all throughout the crucifixion, we get these descriptions of bystanders, people passing by. There's some interesting discussion about where Jesus was actually crucified. If you remember of seeing that film, The Passion of the Christ, it's many depictions, even in history, in art, depict Jesus being crucified kind of up on a hill, far away from Jerusalem. Maybe you'll see the city of Jerusalem in the backgrounds, but they seem to be just in isolation on this hill. Now that is probably accurate in some sense because Jewish law prohibited stonings or executions to be done within the camp of Israel, so they would have wanted the execution to be done outside the camp. But this was a method of execution by the Roman government, which means they would have publicly executed people. They would have wanted someone to be executed in a public space where people could pass by and see, and this executed criminal would be a lesson for those that passed by, be a way to warn the rest of the Roman Empire of what would happen if they also transgressed Roman law. So more likely than not, as Pastor Bench mentioned at the beginning of the service, Jesus was probably crucified just outside the city walls, maybe even off the main road where people would come and go in and out of the city. So Jesus was publicly crucified, naked on a cross. And as the Romans used this as a means of making a lesson or an example out of these criminals, it was reserved for the worst of criminals, which begs the question, why we're told Jesus is crucified with the robbers. If you look at verse 38, we're told that two robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. Now, if these were just robbers, they had just maybe stolen something from the Roman government or stolen something from the high priest, they would have probably been reprimanded, slapped on the wrist, maybe put in jail, but they likely would not have been crucified. This is unfortunately maybe just an older translation of the same word that was used of Barabbas, the insurrectionist, who we just learned about last week. See, the insurrectionists, these were not robbers, they were rebels. They were treasonous terrorists against the Roman Empire. And so for these criminals, these were seen as the worst of criminals in Rome because they would have sought to overthrow the Roman governments. Even just kind of think about, why were there already 3 crosses at Golgotha? I mean, the way people were crucified, they would have carried these cross beams. That's what we're told Simon does. And those cross beams would have been laid on top of a vertical post that was already planted in the ground. It was something that the Roman guards would have had to prepare before the execution took place. Which probably means that that third cross that Jesus was on, the center cross, was probably meant for Barabbas. Which means these two robbers, these two insurrectionists, were likely also insurrectionists with Barabbas. They were in maybe the very same insurrection that Barabbas was in. And so for Jesus to be crucified with them was a sign both that he literally took Barabbas's place, but also that Jesus was counted as an insurrectionist among these other insurrectionists. It was reserved for the lowliest of criminals, the lowest classes. Roman citizens could not be crucified except from a direct decree from Caesar himself. So Jesus, he was crucified as publicly hanging naked as one of the most debased and ridiculed people in society. And just kind of imagine the shame that would have brought upon Jesus, the shame and scorn he would have endured. Many of us have had dreams of being naked, maybe as kids, or feeling exposed before people. And thankfully, those dreams are over in minutes, hopefully, when you're asleep. But Jesus there hung on the cross, an example that could have taken days, but in Jesus' case, took hours at least. There's the embarrassment and shame that Jesus had when he hung on the cross. One commentator even goes so far to visualize the scene for us. He says, one being executed on the cross could not swat flies from one's wounds, nor withhold one's bodily waste from coming out while hanging naked for hours, sometimes days. I don't want to give you any more visualization there, but of the type of shame that Jesus endured on the cross. So I think Matthew's trying to remind us that when it comes to the crucifixion, there is, beyond the physical, there is a social shame, a psychological shame that is maybe even worse. This is not to diminish the physical suffering that Jesus went through. I think Jesus' physical sufferings were definitely part of him paying for our sins on the cross. There needed to be physical suffering in it, but probably more than that was the social suffering and shame Jesus endured. Now, physical suffering is hard. My kids and my family have been sick for the last 9 weeks. So we are tired and exhausted. We feel that. But I think most of us understand that when it comes to deep anguish that we feel, it doesn't often come from physical suffering, but when there's a social or social shame and dimension to it. A novel I recently read called Pachinko recounts the story of Koreans who were imprisoned in Japan, prisoners of war, and then lived through Japan. And all throughout Min-Jin Lee's novel, she talks about the social shame that these Korean Japanese people faced, who often were scorned and rejected by Japanese in Korea and Japan, but couldn't even go home because they would be rejected as being not Korean enough because they were Japanese. And this led to a lot of suicides that happened from these Korean Japanese people at the time. There was this deep anguish that Jesus would have received as he was rejected thoroughly by all people around him. That's another thing that Matthew shows us, that he is rejected thoroughly by all social spheres. It's an interesting detail that we're told that when they offered Jesus wine, it happens twice, happens once in verse 34. They offered him wine to drink mixed with gall, but when he tasted it, he would not drink. And it shows up again a little bit later when they mistake him for calling out to Elijah. There's some question over what this actually means. Are they offering Jesus wine mixed with gall or whatever that was to be a sort of narcotic to help Jesus alleviate the pain he was going through? Some people think that, and there's some precedence for it. In Proverbs 31:6, the Proverbs say, give strong drink to the one who is perishing and wine to those in bitter distress. That was a favorite verse of my non-Christian high school friends that would argue for underage drinking for those that were in pain. It's a way to get out of distress. And so maybe it's the case. Maybe this was a way to dull the senses, to help Jesus endure the pain, very much like how whiskey was used as a painkiller in Prohibition era in World War I. But just kind of think, and so commentators will say if Jesus refused the drink, he was bravely going to the cross, taking the full weight of the punishment for sinners. But again, I think that would draw our attention more on the physical dimension, whereas Matthew wants us to see the social dimension and the shame. If wine was meant to be a painkiller, I'm pretty sure Jesus wouldn't need a sponge. He'd probably need a bucket of it to dull his senses. More likely, this is a connection to Psalm 61:21, when the psalmist writes, "They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst, they gave me sour wine to drink." This is a psalm of lament of David lamenting people around him, mocking him. Mark tells us more specifically that they mixed the wine with myrrh, but Matthew uses more quality of the taste being gall or bitterness. So what was intended to be a thirst quenching maybe for Jesus was only used to mock him further. It kind of reminds me when I was in college, we used to play these amazing race type games on my college campus. And I participated once with my campus ministry. We had to run up 6 flights of stairs. And at the top, we had to chug a bottle of Sprite as our challenge. And, you'd think after running up 6 flights of stairs, a bottle of Sprite would be a welcome quenching to your thirst. And I remember as I started drinking it, I thought, this tastes funny. It doesn't taste weird. Maybe it's just my palate's dry from running so much. It wasn't until I got almost to the end that I realized they had mixed vinegar in with the Sprite just as a joke to mock us for their entertainment. That's probably what the soldiers were doing to Jesus. What was intended to be a thirst-quenching act was really just for their entertainment. Again, Matthew gives us this picture where Jesus is thoroughly mocked. He's alone. He's shamed with no one to comfort him. There are no comforts near him. We even see that in all social spheres, Jesus is rejected and mocked. From the high-class priests to low-class criminals on his left and right to everyone in between with the crowds and the bystanders, he is ridiculed by all. We're even told that they use some of the very same tactics that Satan uses in the wilderness in Matthew 4, maybe indicating that this is Satan's last final attempt to tempt Jesus out of the cross, when even Satan used the term, "Son of God, take yourself down," or "throw yourself down that people may be saved." The same thing that the chief priests mock Jesus with. The religious leaders even mock Jesus with this sense of because he is not delivered by God, he must be rejected by God. There's a sense in their mockery that because he is not saved by God, he's not delivered, he's therefore been rejected by God. And embedded, I think, in their mockery is this idea that those that are accepted by God, they should be alleviated from suffering by God. It's common Jewish understanding that I think maybe even Matthew cues us into to see, along with Simon, that identifying with Jesus will mean identifying in his rejection and his shame in the world's eyes. Simon stands alone here as the only one by Jesus' side. There's no one around him. We'll see a little bit later that there are some faithful disciples, but they're not here at the crucifixion. Simon's the only one. He's called to carry the cross of Jesus. And it's interesting, even the very same language that's used of Simon bearing Jesus' cross, it mimics what Jesus says earlier to his disciples in chapter 16, verse 24. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." There's probably some irony that Matthew's showing us here that this was a job meant for the disciples. The disciples literally should have been by Jesus' side in his last hours, bearing his cross, following him to Golgotha. And yet even his own disciples have deserted him, as we've seen all throughout the last few chapters of Matthew's accounts. This isn't so much a comment, I think, on Simon's bravery or courage. I mean, he was just thrown into it. He didn't volunteer, but simply by nature of being there, he was chosen to bear Jesus' cross. We don't really know why they choose Simon, but Mark tells us some details about Simon that lead us to believe that he was a disciple of Jesus, or at least became a follower of Jesus after the fact. So it's possible that Simon was one of the very few disciples left, even at the scene, and the guards recognized him as, in mockery, called him to bear Jesus' cross as they walked up to Golgotha. See, Matthew's illustrating a point that if anyone's left to follow Jesus, mockery, shame, and rejection should follow because Jesus is a king of suffering and shame. There's an ironic picture here where Jesus is a king, and yet he's a king who trades a crown of jewels for a crown of thorns. He's a king who trades a throne for a cross. He's a king who, instead of having royal advisors on his left and right, he has criminals on his left and right. Instead of loyal subjects who adore him, there are a crowd of enemies who mock him. Matthew reminds us that following Jesus means following in the shame of the cross. I think a lot of times we talk about how in the cross, what Jesus accomplished is he wipes away our shame. And he certainly does that. Jesus bears our shame for us before God the Father so that in our sin, there is no longer need to be shamed before a holy God. But that doesn't mean that Jesus removes all shame over us completely. Because to follow Jesus, we should expect there will be social shame, some dimension of shame from the world. And as much as we may want to free ourselves from that, to think that there will be no rejection or shame in following Jesus is to think just like the people that mocked Jesus, that those who are pleased by God should not suffer or face shame or rejection. But I think this is where the beauty of the cross comes. What the cross accomplishes, it allows us to embrace that shame along with Simon in following Jesus. If we kind of think about how our world tries to throw off shame, how our world tries to feel more justified and not feel ashamed of anything, it's usually a message of accept yourself, love yourself, be confident in who you are, and don't let anyone tell you anything otherwise. But if that's the case, then our social honor, so to speak, our confidence in ourselves, it's a fragile thing that stands only on our own abilities. See, but what Jesus accomplishes here, if he wipes away any shame that we could ever have before God as Father, then we don't need to feel, we're free from this need to justify ourselves socially. It frees us from the need to rid ourselves of shame before the world because we have all the honor we could ever have in the Father's eyes. So come what may, following Jesus is an invitation to embrace scorn and shame in the world because we can cling to Christ and who pays for our shame before God and brings us that acceptance. See, despite what suffering or shame may come, we can trust in the power of God in the cross. This is our next point. Matthew leads us to confess the power of God with the centurion. We see this here in the next section. If we read in verses 45 through 54, now from the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, this man is calling Elijah. One of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs also were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, truly, this was the Son of God. Upon Jesus' death on the cross, we get this confession of the centurion that Jesus was the Son of God. This term Son of God has a lot of Old Testament background behind it. It can mean a lot of things, but by and large, for Matthew's accounts, it refers to Jesus' divinity coming from God and his power, being God himself with the power of God. This is why if you notice just before the crowds and the chief priests, they mock Jesus for being the Son of God because he does not have the divine power to save himself. Even earlier in Matthew chapter 4, as we mentioned, Satan uses the title to call Jesus to unlawfully exercise his divinity and power. This Son of God confession, it reveals the power that Jesus displayed even in his death, surprisingly. It's curious why the centurion made this confession when he saw Jesus die. I mean, I kind of think about, we're told that Jesus had a great cry, a loud voice when he yielded up his spirit. Makes me think of William Wallace in Braveheart. If you remember that movie when he's being executed and he cries, "Freedom!" and all the crowds are in awe before him. Maybe that's something what's going on. There's this triumphant cry that Jesus gives that caused him to confess this was the Son of God. But more than even just how he dies, the centurion observes what happens around Jesus. And Matthew tells us that because of the way Jesus died and what happens, this led the centurion to confess Jesus as the Son of God. Now, we're told he just sees the earthquake and what took place, but we're also told of these 3 signs that happen at Jesus' death. I think Matthew wants us to see 3 signs that address or mimic the 3 mockings of the crowds, the chief priests, and the criminals. Just as Jesus was comprehensively rejected and shamed in society, so Matthew shows us that Jesus comprehensively has power over all creation, spanning from the heavens above with the tearing of the temple to the earth below with the tombs and everything in between with the earthquake. At the cross, Jesus displays the power of God over the natural world, spiritual order, and even death itself. We'll look at these 3. First, the earthquake, being God's power over the natural world. Earthquakes were often signs throughout the Old Testament of God's intervention, God doing something mighty in creation. It could have been a sign even of God's judgment and the coming judgment or end times of God. But in the cross, Jesus reveals his power over all life in creation, inaugurating these end times in which he now reigns over his creation, and Christ is intervening to reveal the power that the cross brings, breaking strongholds of evil, injustice, and whatever chaos that ensues in creation. He also displays the power of God over the spiritual order when we're told that the curtain tears in 2. There's some debate over which curtain this was. There were 2 curtains at the temple. There was the outer curtain that would have been more visible if the centurion saw that. This was the curtain that likely divided the inner courts from the outer courts, probably signifying that when that curtain was torn, God was inviting all people to himself in salvation, not just Jews, but Gentiles as well. And so maybe these Gentile centurions were seeing this happen and realizing that this was the Son of God because now he invites all people to come to himself. But it could have also been the inner curtain, even if they may not have been able to see it. This could have been a demonstration of God opening up the most holy chamber of the temple, where only the high priest could enter but once a year. And yet in Christ's death, that barrier, that division between God and his holiness and all people was now done away with. See, in tearing the curtain, Jesus was breaking down the barriers between God and man, overcoming our sin that prevented us from coming to him. And the last one we're told of are the tombs, God's power over death itself. It's a little bit of a strange insertion here because we're told that the tombs open, but then the bodies raise after Jesus rose. Now you got to wonder, did those bodies rise on Friday, on Good Friday? And then they're just kind of hanging out in the tombs waiting for Jesus to rise before they come out on Easter Sunday? Or did the tombs open and those bodies lay dead until Jesus rose on Easter Sunday? It's kind of an odd insertion. If Matthew is trying to tell us something about the resurrection, why wouldn't he just put this later in Matthew chapter 28? Why not tell us that after Jesus rose, then many other saints rose and appeared to the saints? I think there's a purpose here that Matthew wants to connect the cross with his power over death itself by mentioning the tombs. Because when the tombs open, and Matthew tells us that eventually the dead rose, in the cross, Jesus began the work of conquering death by death. Jesus conquers death itself through the death of Christ, God's own Son. And so that as people come to Christ, as we come to him, we see the power of the cross on display as the cross breaks down barriers of death. See, Matthew shows us that Jesus displays the power of the cross when he saves sinners who now have access to God and brings us from death to new life in him. All throughout Matthew's gospel, this term Son of God, it's only used by the disciples and only twice. There's only 2 times that the disciples confess Jesus as the Son of God. And this is the very first time that it's used by an outsider, someone who's not one of the disciples. What's even more striking is the very people that should have seen Jesus as the Son of God, the chief priests, religious leaders, they mock him for being so. And the most unlikely people, the centurions and the Roman guards, confess Jesus as the Son of God. The centurions and the Roman guards, these were men employed by Rome, which meant they would have seen Caesar as the Son of God. It was a term they would have often attributed to their leader. He is the Son of God, meaning he's endowed with the divinities or the deity's power. And so for them to completely turn their allegiance away from Rome and to Christ was to be an unlikely confession of Jesus as Son of God. Even just think about who these centurions and guards were. These were probably the very same guards that just had divided up Jesus' clothes when he was crucified. These are maybe even the same guards that were just a few verses earlier beating Jesus, mocking him, scourging him. Imagine all that they went through abusing Jesus, and now they make a drastic turn to confess he's the Son of God. See, Matthew's illustrating a powerful point that in the cross, Jesus dies to bring from death to life the very people that deserve his punishment, the most unlikely of people. Even in his abusers, Jesus demonstrates the power of the cross to save any and all that come to him. He doesn't save the heroes of the story. There are no heroes in the story except for Jesus. And we can sometimes read this and try to find who are the good characters that we need to be like. And I think Matthew does intend that, as we'll see. But in this point, I think Matthew also wants us to remember there are no good characters on their own. And even if there were, we would not identify with them. We are all the villains that need Jesus saving. Which means as we consider the power of the cross today, anytime we witness Jesus save someone, that's a demonstration of the power of the cross over the natural order, over the spiritual order, and over death itself. It's a reminder that God is still powerful to save, just as he was 2,000 years ago. It's something we'll get to celebrate next week in some baptisms of brothers and sisters that will confess Jesus as the Son of God in our service. But I'll be honest, living and ministering in San Francisco for as long as I have, there's some times that I can forget that, where I forget that God is still powerful to save. It can be easy to kind of forget that when we go out and we live in our city, if you're a believer, if you do confess Jesus as the Son of God, it can sometimes feel lonely that we're the few, that there aren't many out there, that even when we talk with non-believers around us, they would rather ridicule us than listen to us about the gospel that we hold hope in. But every time that we see people confess faith in Jesus, it's a reminder that God is still at work to save people to himself. God can still save the most unlikely of people who are even hostile to him today, because he saved you and me, people who were once hostile against him. So even if you have a story where you grew up in the church, I think it's funny when people say, well, I've been a Christian since birth. That's not really the case, because even in your birth, God orchestrated things to call you to himself. God planted you in a family that brought you to this church or another church that preached the gospel, that led you to see your sin, that led you to confess God as powerful over sin. See, God was doing that powerfully through every step of our way. And even when we look at our own salvation, it's a reminder that God is powerful over sin and even over death. So that even when it seems like death is at work all around us, as this story tells us, We can confess with a centurion, there is still God's power to save and God's power over sin and death. And it's a reminder and a call to wait faithfully in the midst of darkness. That's our last point. The cross calls us to wait faithfully in darkness with Joseph and the women. We see this in this last account, verses 55 through 61. There were also many women there looking on from a distance who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. We're told of these final two groups of characters in Matthew's account of Jesus' death and burial in Joseph and the women. I don't think we're supposed to see that these are, like I said, the heroes, the super faithful, the righteous. But I do think we're supposed to see that despite the circumstances of death and darkness reigning, they remain faithful in small ways. Joseph is an example of faithfulness in the darkness. Even though we're told in other gospel accounts that, Luke tells us he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the very ruling body that condemned Jesus to death. Luke tells us he didn't consent to do that. John tells us that because he was of the Sanhedrin, that Joseph of Arimathea followed Jesus secretly because he was afraid of the Sanhedrin. By and large, he's not the most exemplary of disciples. And yet in this moment, he displays a faithfulness in his waiting, even though he didn't know what was going to happen. He faithfully uses his own tomb to bury Jesus, probably meaning this was either very costly, because if he gave up his tomb for Jesus, he would have to buy a new one for himself. Or what I think more likely is these were family tombs. And if Jesus was buried in his tomb, that would mean Joseph would then be buried with Jesus when he was dead. Remember, meaning that if he was a member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph would have been counted amongst the criminals when he was buried with Jesus' body. He went to ask Pilate for the body. That would have taken great courage, because if Jesus really was an insurrectionist, then he would have been against the government of Rome. But even if Pilate was nonchalant about it, it would have outed Joseph to his Sanhedrin peers that he had some compassion for Jesus, where the rest of the Sanhedrin condemned him. Joseph was risking his livelihood, his profession as a member of the council in Jerusalem, probably a profession that even led him to Jerusalem in the first place, because we're told he was from Arimathea, not Jerusalem. He probably moved there when he was selected to be part of the Sanhedrin council. See, Joseph was giving up so much of his livelihood and future to simply wait faithfully on Jesus. We're even told he was discipled by Jesus. This is a specific term. Our translations just read he was a disciple of Jesus, using the noun form, but this is one of the rare instances where it's the verb form, that he wasn't just a disciple of, but he was discipled by Jesus. Probably indicating that he didn't just follow Jesus from afar, but Jesus personally had a relation with him, discipling him as his rabbi. Regardless of what he knew was going to come, Joseph risked scorn and rejection to faithfully follow Jesus. It's a similar picture we get of the women here who wait faithfully from a distance, Matthew tells us. They were watching on from a distance. Now, this could be another detail or example of Jesus being alone without the women that were largely with him, ministering to him. But I don't think this is as much about Jesus' abandonment by the women, but probably more of the women's faithfulness, even in following Jesus from a distance. You see, women were not allowed to be disciples of a rabbi in their times. For the women to come close and draw near to Jesus may have even been scandalous to be seen that way, especially if their sons and husbands were not there with them as well. See, these women, even from a distance in their limitations, they were mourning and following Jesus from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem, probably being a sign not just of their physical following of Jesus, but spiritually their posture as followers of Jesus wherever he went. We're even told that they were the They were there in the darkness when Jesus was buried at the tomb, and they were the first people there at the tomb at the day of resurrection, likely grieving, waiting, hoping. There's a picture that Matthew gives us that even though these women and Joseph didn't know what was going to happen, even though all seemed lost to them, even though it seemed like death was reigning and Jesus was gone, they still were faithful in whatever next steps that they could take, regardless of what shame and rejection it would take for them. See, Matthew reminds us that following Jesus means waiting faithfully even in the midst of darkness. Even if we can't see the power of God at work around us, it's a reminder to hold out hope that Jesus does not leave us in darkness, because death is not the final answer. The very center of our story, we get this cry of Jesus from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Again, there's some confusion or question. What does this mean? Was Jesus severed from the Godhead? Could the triune God cut itself off? Is that even possible? Regardless of theologically what's happening, we don't really know. What we do know is that in that moment, Jesus experienced the forsakenness and abandonment of the Father. That in that moment on the cross, in his death, he felt that God was far from him. And he only quotes Psalm 22, the first verse, not the latter parts, which talk about the triumph of God over death and abandonment. See, in Jesus' cry at the cross, it's a reminder that while even though we may experience what feels like God's abandonment in darkness and death, because Jesus really was abandoned, we never will be by God himself. As much as it may feel like death reigns around us, that we're alone in this world or this city, that maybe it feels like God's abandoned us, he's not working anymore, the cry of the cross reminds us that regardless of our experience, the reality is that God will never leave us or forsake us. Because Jesus was abandoned by the Father, we never will be. This reminds me of maybe a silly story, but when I think about crying out to the Father like this, feeling a sense of abandonment maybe, and yet knowing that God is still there even if we don't feel it. Think back to a time when I was a kid and I was crying out for my dad. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. And my dad was getting ready to leave the house. He was gonna take me with him to his job. He worked in the evenings, not leave me home by myself. And so he was getting ready. I thought I'd watch the TV show while I'm waiting. Eventually he was ready and he said, "Clark, it's time to leave the house." I was like, "No, I wanna finish my TV show." And being the genius parent that my dad was, he said, "Okay, fine, I'll leave you here." And I called his bluff. I said, "All right, leave then. I'm gonna stay and watch my TV show." Remember, I'm only 7 or 8. Don't call Child Protective Services on my dad. He was a great dad. And he left the house. Now, I didn't really think much of it because I was locked into my TV show. But as soon as the show was over, 5 minutes later, I realized what had happened. My dad had abandoned me. He left a 7-year-old boy at home by himself. And I did what any young child would do by instinct. I ran to the window, threw it open, and started screaming for my dad. "Dad, Daddy, come back." His car was already gone out of the driveway. What felt like maybe hours to me was probably only 5 minutes, but my dad came driving and pulling up back into the driveway and running into the house to get me. And in my moment of need, I felt abandoned by my dad. But you know what also I felt? I thought, man, it worked. My cry brought my dad back. Now I came later to realize that was his tactic to try to teach me a lesson. And he just drove around the block knowing that I would cry out for him and came right back. But I think that's an illustration of how we can sometimes feel in the midst of darkness. It can sometimes feel and seem like God is absent. We can sometimes think, we may look around and think, our Father's gone. He's left us on our own in this world, and he's just jumped ship. But what may seem like abandonment on our part is part of the good plan of our Father, who still cares, who still hears, who still magically will hear our cries, and who will come back for us. Matthew calls us to wait patiently and faithfully in the midst of that darkness, knowing that the cross is our assurance, that because Jesus did cry abandonment in our cries, we know we have a Father that hears us, regardless of what it may seem. And so we hold out hope for the power of the cross, something we'll talk about this week at Holy Week, next Friday, Good Friday, and certainly on Easter Sunday. Let's pray together.